The voicemail wasn't meant for me. I know that now. But on a Tuesday morning in early October, standing in our kitchen in my deployment, boots still laced from the night before, I pressed play on the wrong phone and heard a voice I didn't recognize say, "Marcus, it's Cole. Listen, I went through the paperwork you left on my desk. The second account, the one tied to the Clarksville property, it's flagged. You need to call me before this gets escalated. And brother, I'm telling you this as a friend, not a colleague. Whatever you're hiding, fix it now." I stood there for a long time. The coffee maker beeped. Outside, the neighbor's dog barked twice and went quiet. My husband's phone had been charging beside mine. Same black case. Same cracked corner from when he dropped it at the airport the day I flew home from overseas. We'd laughed about that. 2 weeks ago, at baggage claim, he'd kissed my forehead and told me the house smelled like me again the minute I walked back in. I believed every single word. I set the phone down carefully, the way you set down something fragile before it breaks on the floor and takes everything with it. My name is Sarah. I'm 29 years old. I spent 4 years in the Army Signal Corps, including one 7-month deployment to a base outside Kandahar that I still don't fully talk about. I married my husband 3 months before I shipped out in a small ceremony at my mother's house in Clarksville, Tennessee. My sister stood beside me in a yellow dress. My father's chair sat empty in the front row with a single white rose on the seat, the same way we'd done it at every family milestone since his heart gave out 2 Januaries ago. I was good at my job. I could analyze signal patterns in a data stream at 2 in the morning with bad coffee and no sleep and still find the anomaly. I knew how to read what didn't belong, and standing there in my own kitchen on a Tuesday, I understood with the cold, flat certainty of someone trained to trust patterns over feelings that something in my life had gone very wrong. I didn't call Marcus. I didn't call anyone. Instead, I went upstairs, changed out of my fatigues, and sat on the edge of the bed where I'd slept for 2 weeks like everything was normal. The ceiling fan spun. The curtains my mother helped me pick out shifted in the air. I thought about the way my husband had looked at me at baggage claim, not with relief the way I'd thought, but with something else. Something managed. My sister had been at the airport too. She'd hugged me so hard I'd laughed and told her she was cutting off my circulation. She'd pressed her face into my shoulder and said, "I miss you so much, Sarah. You have no idea." I believed that too. I called in that I wouldn't be on base until afternoon. Then I opened my laptop and started doing what I was trained to do. I started looking. The VA home loan we'd applied for was my benefit. I'd earned it. 4 years, 1 deployment, 1 shrapnel scar along my left forearm that still tightened in cold weather. We'd used part of it to buy our house on the west side of Clarksville. That part I knew. But Cole's voicemail had mentioned a second property, a second account. I searched through our shared financial folder, the one Marcus had set up when I deployed and said was for easy access if anything comes up. It took me 40 minutes to find it. Not because it was well hidden, but because I'd never thought to look. A property in my name in Gallatin, Tennessee. Purchased 8 months ago, 3 months into my deployment. Mortgage payments drawn from an account I'd never opened, funded by a direct deposit from my military housing allowance that had been quietly redirected. Not all of it. Just enough to not trigger an alert on my end. Just enough that if I never looked closely, I'd never see it. The account had a second authorized user, Jenna Ann Mitchell, my sister. I closed the laptop. I got up and went to the bathroom and ran cold water over my wrists until my hands stopped shaking. Then I looked at myself in the mirror for a while. I had my father's eyes. Dark, steady, the kind that didn't panic easily. He used to say that to me when I was 12 and anxious about everything. "You've got the calm eyes, Sarah. When it matters, they'll hold." They were holding now, but barely. I thought about my father often in the weeks that followed. He'd been a corrections officer for 22 years, a man who believed in systems, in accountability, in doing the right thing even when it was expensive. After he died, my mother had given me the one thing he'd always kept on his dresser, a small framed index card in his handwriting. 6 words. The truth doesn't need your permission. I'd hung it in my locker at base. I'd read it before missions, before hard conversations, before the days that asked too much of me. I read it now in my head, standing in my bathroom in Clarksville, and understood for the first time that he'd written it for exactly this kind of day. I spent the next 3 days doing nothing that looked like anything. I cooked dinner. I asked Marcus about his work. I sat with my sister on her porch one afternoon drinking sweet tea while she told me about a guy she'd been seeing. Someone who traveled for work, she said, hard to pin down. She tucked her feet up under her on the chair the way she'd done since we were teenagers and complained about how the leaves were late turning this year. I watched her mouth move and thought about the property deed with her name on it. About the account. About the way she'd hugged me at the airport like I was something she needed to hold on to. I'd have said my sister was my best friend before all this. Most people say that about their sister, and it's just language. For us, it had been true. She was 4 years older than me. She'd helped me fill out my ASVAB study guides at our mother's kitchen table. She'd driven 6 hours to pin on my corporal stripes. She'd been the first person I called when I found out I was deploying. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over you when someone you love completely becomes a stranger. It doesn't shout. It just sits there, in the middle of everything familiar, and won't move. That Friday, I drove to Marcus's firm on my lunch break. I didn't go inside. I sat in the parking lot and waited. At 12:40, a man came out and walked to his car, mid-40s, veteran's build, the kind of posture that doesn't leave you. He had a lanyard with the firm's logo and a cell phone already to his ear. I got out and called his name. Cole? He turned. His expression shifted through several things in under 2 seconds. Recognition, calculation, discomfort. You must be Sarah, he said. I got your voicemail, I said. The one you left for my husband on my phone by mistake. He stood very still. In the pause between us, I heard a truck pass on the street behind me and the distant sound of a lunch order being called out from the sandwich shop next door. You should come sit down, he said finally. We sat at a picnic table outside the sandwich shop. He was a veteran himself. 10 years Army, financial crimes unit before he transitioned out. That was how he'd spotted it. Marcus had been moving money through 3 accounts, 2 of which were tied to my benefits and structured to look like routine transactions. The Gallatin property wasn't the first thing he'd purchased using my housing allowance. There were 2 others. One, a short-term rental in Nashville that had been pulling profit for 6 months. One, a piece of land near the Tennessee-Kentucky border that was listed under a holding company Marcus had created 3 months before our wedding. I thought it was a mistake at first, Cole said, his voice careful. An admin error. So I ran the numbers again. He looked out toward the parking lot. I'm sorry. I really am. I tried to give him the chance to fix it before. He stopped. Before I found out, I said. He nodded. Is this federal? I asked. Misappropriation of military benefits? He said. Yes, that's federal. I drove back to base. I sat in my car in the lot for 11 minutes. Then I walked inside and went to work because that's what you do when the mission isn't finished. You complete the task in front of you. That evening, Marcus made pasta. He opened a bottle of red wine and asked me how my day was. He was easy in his skin, the way someone is easy when they don't know they've been found. I watched him move around the kitchen and thought about the index card. The truth doesn't need your permission. How's Jenna? He asked. She seemed good, I said. She mentioned she's been seeing someone. Yeah, he said, not turning from the stove. I said. Someone who travels a lot. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she always did like the complicated ones. I said nothing. I poured myself a glass of water and watched the way the light moved across the kitchen counter, and I thought about the 7 months I'd spent in Afghanistan, convinced that my life back home was whole. 3 days later, I sat across from Captain Diane Holloway at the JAG office on base. She was 42, sharp, the kind of woman who had learned to hold authority quietly because she'd had to earn it twice as hard. I laid out everything I had, the documents, the account screenshots, Cole's written statement, the property deeds. I did it the way I'd been trained to compile evidence, chronological, sourced, without editorializing. She read through it in silence. When she finished, she looked up. "Your husband did this while you were deployed," she said. "Yes, ma'am. And your sister was a co-beneficiary on at least one of the accounts." "Yes, ma'am." She set the folder down and folded her hands on top of it. "I want you to understand what happens when we open a case like this. It's no longer yours to manage." "I know," I said. "You sure about that?" I thought about my father. About the 6 words on the index card. About the 7 months I'd carried a radio through a country I could barely see in the dark, trusting that the people back home were holding the life I'd left them with. "Yes, ma'am," I said. "I'm sure." She opened the folder again. "Then let's begin." What followed wasn't dramatic. That surprised me somehow. I'd expected something to break open, some loud, terrible release. Instead, it was paperwork, phone calls, meetings in offices with fluorescent lights and government furniture, military investigators, federal financial crimes, civil attorneys. My name moved through systems I'd spent my career trusting, and I sat in waiting rooms and answered questions and signed things and tried to remember to eat. My mother knew before Marcus did. I drove to her house on a Sunday morning and told her over coffee at her kitchen table, the same table where I'd done my ASVAB prep, where my sister had helped me study. My mother listened without interrupting. She was 61 and had buried her husband and raised 2 daughters on a corrections officer's pension, and she had the particular stillness of someone who has already outlasted several things that should have ended her. When I finished, she reached across the table and covered my hands with hers. "Both of them," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the old oak in the backyard, the one my father had planted the year I was born. My mother looked out the window at it for a moment. Then she looked back at me. "When your daddy worked corrections," she said, "he used to say the saddest cases weren't the violent ones. They were the ones where the person got away with it so long they forgot it was wrong." She squeezed my hands. "Don't you carry their forgetting, Sarah. That's not yours to hold." I cried for the first time since the voicemail. Not long, just enough to make room for what came next. Marcus received formal notice 2 weeks later. I wasn't there when it happened. I'd moved my things to my mother's house by then, quietly over 2 evenings while he was at work. I left the house keys on the kitchen counter beside the coffee maker. I didn't leave a note. I'd said everything I needed to say in a room with federal investigators and a JAG officer, under oath, on the record. That felt right. It felt like the language that fit. My sister called me 4 times that first week. I let every call go to voicemail. I wasn't ready. I understood the difference between being ready and avoiding something. My mother had taught me that, and I wasn't avoiding. I was making sure that when I finally spoke to her, I wouldn't say something I couldn't take back. That was discipline, not cowardice. There's a difference, and it matters. On the 22nd day after Cole's voicemail, I drove to Gallatin. I don't know exactly why. The property was locked, a small ranch house on a quiet street with a detached garage and a willow in the yard. It had curtains in the window. Someone had planted mums by the front walkway, orange and yellow, the kind my mother grew every fall. I sat across the street in my car and looked at it for a long time. Someone had put my name on this deed. Someone had used 7 months of my military service, 7 months of my absence, to build something I hadn't known existed with a person I'd trusted completely. And it was a small, ordinary house on a quiet street with a willow tree and fall flowers by the door. The thing about betrayal is that it doesn't look like what you expect. You expect dark and obvious. You expect something that announces itself. You don't expect orange mums and a willow tree on a Tuesday in October. I drove back to my mother's. That night, I opened my father's old service box, the one my mother kept on the shelf in the hallway. Inside was his retirement badge, a folded letter from his supervisor from 2009, and the index card in its small frame. I picked it up. The truth doesn't need your permission. I thought about all the years that card had sat on his dresser. I thought about what he'd seen in 22 years of work, all the ways people deceived each other and themselves, and how he'd still gone to work every morning and done the job honestly. I put the card in my jacket pocket. Then I went to bed and slept better than I had in a month. The federal case moved slowly, the way federal cases do. Marcus's firm terminated him within days of the notice. The properties were flagged pending resolution. Cole testified. I testified. Captain Holloway's office had seen similar cases before. Service members' benefits misused while they were deployed, usually by someone with access and a reason to believe they wouldn't be caught. She told me once, at the end of a long session, that I'd handed them one of the cleaner evidence packages she'd worked with. You documented everything, she said. I'm Signal Corps, I said. She almost smiled. Right. My sister came to my mother's house on a Saturday morning in November, 6 weeks after everything had started moving. I heard her car pull into the driveway. My mother came to the back room where I was reading and said simply, "She's here." Not asking me to do anything. Not telling me what to do. Just letting me know. I went to the door. She looked worse than I'd expected. Thinner, eyes raw, wearing a coat I recognized as one she'd had since college. She stood on my mother's porch and didn't try to come inside, and when she saw me, she didn't offer an excuse or an explanation. She just said my name, Sarah. I opened the storm door and stood in the frame. The cold came in. I need to say something, she said. Okay, I said. I knew it was wrong. She paused, jaw tight. I knew from the beginning. He told me you two were, that things had been difficult before you deployed, that you'd both agreed the marriage wasn't working. She stopped again. I should have called you. I should have asked you directly. I didn't. I chose to believe the easier thing because I wanted to. She was crying now, quietly, the way our family cries. No performance. Just the thing itself. The property, she said. I didn't know about the money, Sarah. I want you to know that. He said the account was a shared savings he'd set up for both of you. I thought my name was on it because he was going to tell you and wanted everything to be ready. She shook her head. That sounds stupid now. It does, I said. I wasn't unkind when I said it, but I didn't soften it either. She nodded. I know. We stood there. The oak in the yard dropped a few remaining leaves in the wind. Somewhere down the street, a child was calling someone's name. I'm not going to tell you it's okay right now, I said. Because it isn't. And I'm not going to tell you that we're fine, because we're not that either. She looked at me. But I'm not going to carry this forever, I said. I don't have the room for it, and neither do you. I paused. So here's what I can tell you right now. I'm not done being your sister. I don't know yet what that looks like, but I'm not done. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Her shoulders shook once. Okay, she finally said. Okay, I let her in. My mother made coffee. The three of us sat at the kitchen table and didn't talk about any of it for a while. My mother talked about the oak tree. My sister talked about her job. I talked about nothing in particular. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It was just the first step toward the direction of it. You have to start walking before you know the road. By January, the federal investigation had produced a consent agreement. Marcus would repay the misappropriated funds with interest and complete a financial probation period. The properties were to be liquidated and the proceeds returned to me. It wasn't a dramatic verdict. No handcuffs, no courtroom speech. Just numbers on a page and signatures and the mechanical process of accountability doing its work. My mother hung the index card on her kitchen wall that winter. She'd asked me if she could have it, and I'd said yes without hesitating. The truth doesn't need your permission. She said she'd always wanted it, that it had been her idea when he was struggling with a case years ago, and they'd worked out the words together at this same table. I hadn't known that. I thought it had been entirely his. She smiled when I told her. Most of the best things we think of alone, we actually made together, she said. I re-enlisted in March. Captain Holloway had asked, back in November, whether I'd considered staying in legal services. "You think clearly under pressure," she said, "and you know how to compile a case." I'd thought about it seriously. But in the end, Signal Corps was where I understood myself best. The work of communication, of making sure the right information got to the right place at the right time. It felt, suddenly, deeply personal in a way it hadn't been before. I was assigned to Fort Campbell's communications training program, working with incoming soldiers on secure transmission protocols. The first class I taught, I had 14 privates looking at me across a training room like they were waiting for something important. I started with the technical material the way I was supposed to. Then I stopped. "Before we go further," I said, "I want to tell you one thing that has nothing to do with encryption standards." They waited. "You're going to be in places where you're far from home, and you're trusting people to hold your life while you're gone. Most of them will. A few won't. When that happens, and for some of you it will happen, the information is still worth having. The truth is always worth having, even when it costs you something." One of the privates, a young woman from Ohio who couldn't have been more than 19, raised her hand. "How do you deal with it, ma'am? When the thing you find out wrecks everything?" I thought about a kitchen in October and a voicemail and orange mums in front of a house with my name on the deed. I thought about my father's handwriting on an index card, about my mother's hands on mine across the kitchen table. "You don't deal with it," I said. "You live through it. There's a difference. Dealing with something means putting it somewhere it fits. Living through something means it changes the shape of you and you walk forward anyway." I paused, "And you remember that being changed isn't the same as being broken." She nodded slowly, like she was storing it somewhere safe. After class, I walked out to the far end of the base where you could see the tree line and, on clear days, the Cumberland River in the distance. The air was cold and clean, the kind of March cold that feels like it's making room for something. I had the index card in my jacket pocket. I'd started carrying it again after my mother framed a copy for herself. I took it out and held it for a moment without reading it. I already knew the words. I thought about my father standing at his dresser every morning before a shift, reading those 6 words, reminding himself of what he owed to the job and to himself. I thought about the way he'd held his integrity through 22 years of watching people fail each other and still gone home and been good to his family. I thought about how he planted that oak tree the year I was born, not because he'd see it fully grown, but because someone would. I put the card back in my pocket. My sister called that evening. We talked for 40 minutes, real talk, not careful talk, about our mother and a road trip we were planning in the summer, and a documentary she'd watched about deep-sea biology that she couldn't stop thinking about. At the end, she said, "I'm glad you picked up." "Me too," I said. And I meant it. Not all the way, not without reservation, but enough to be true. That felt like progress. It felt like the difference between surviving something and beginning to live past it. Some nights I still thought about the kitchen in October, about setting down that phone, about the particular silence of a house that holds a lie you haven't discovered yet. But the thing I noticed, when I let myself sit with it honestly, was that I didn't feel like a victim in that silence anymore. I felt like someone who had walked through a door she hadn't planned on opening and found out, on the other side, that she was more capable than she'd known. My father would have called that the point of hard things. I think he would have been right. There's a board in the JAG hallway at Fort Campbell, a simple court board with resources for service members dealing with legal and financial issues. A few months after my case closed, Captain Holloway asked if I'd be willing to add my name to a list of soldiers who'd agree to speak confidentially with others going through similar situations. Not as a counselor, just as someone who'd been there. I said yes without thinking about it twice. The first call I took was from a private at Fort Bragg whose husband had taken out loans in her name while she was in Kuwait. She cried for part of it. I let her. When she stopped, I said, "You found out. That's already the hardest step. You know the truth now." "I don't know what to do with it," she said. "You don't have to know yet," I said. "The truth will wait for you. It's patient like that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Someone told you that." "Someone who knew," I said. After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a little while. Outside the window, the sun was doing the particular thing it does in Tennessee in late April, low and gold through young leaves, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's just starting. I thought, yes, exactly like that.